Hi, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, which is entitled Gaza on the Brink of an Outbreak. We will be getting started momentarily as folks hop on, so just give me a couple of moments and we will be starting shortly. Thank you. All right, so good afternoon. We are here today, this is Tuesday, September 8th, for what should be a very interesting discussion on what is going on in the Gaza Strip. The webinar is entitled Gaza on the Brink of an Outbreak. And I want to introduce myself. I am Hannah Morris. I'm J Street's Assistant Director of Government Affairs. And the conversation today will really be focused on what's happened over the last several weeks and months in the Gaza Strip, starting with the rockets and incendiary balloons that were sent over by Hamas onto the Gaza-Israeli border. This was followed by an Israeli response that not only led to attacks on Hamas's military infrastructure, but also led to the closure of the Kerem Shalom Crossing, which is a lifeline for the Gaza Strip. In the last week and a half, there has actually been a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, and we're going to look at how that was negotiated and why. And on top of that, there has been an outbreak of coronavirus also in the last couple of weeks. And this is the first instance of community transmission in the Gaza Strip, 6 months into the global pandemic. So why now? How did that happen? So to take us through these developments and help us understand really what is happening on the ground, I am very, very pleased to have Tanya Harry. Tanya is the Executive Director of Gisha, which is the legal center for freedom of movement. She has been with Gisha since 2007 and is a real expert on what is going on in Gaza. She has lectured on the issue on numerous occasions and published in such publications as Haaretz, Plus 972, and The Forward. So thank you, Tanya, for joining us. And to get us started, I'd really love for you to help us understand what has gone on in the last month or two. As I mentioned earlier, we had incendiary balloons and rockets coming onto the Gaza-Israeli border from Hamas. We had an Israeli response that, in some ways, we of course believe is justified with regards to Hamas, but then also a response that really affected Gaza residents. And we'll go into what that meant with fuel supplies and other goods. And then we've had a ceasefire that seemingly came out of the blue and was negotiated by the Qataris. So can you help us understand what's actually happened? And did COVID-19 play into these negotiations at all? Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank everyone for joining this discussion. I never take it for granted that people give their attention to what's happening in the Gaza Strip, especially at these moments when, globally we're dealing with so many issues. So I really want to thank you for being with us today. It's always hard to kind of pinpoint when did this latest round start? And I think that's really because what we're looking at, between Hamas and Israel is an ongoing, kind of situation of tension and ceasefires, I would say in plural, which continue to be negotiated. So it's, of course, an ongoing conflict between them, and they're certainly not equal parties. There's a lot that can be said about that. But various ceasefires which have been signed, not signed, but come to, agreements on over the years, ending 3 major military operations, of course, that have taken place since 2007. And I think that we do need to see this latest round in that kind of series of events, or in their relationship in general. What you always have is a kind of gradual building of tensions And there's a lot that we don't know. I mean, even people like myself and others who are following the situation closely, we're talking about developments that are happening at the highest levels. You know, these are, of course, parties that are not said to be openly speaking to one another. So you do have intermediaries. I don't doubt that there are also connections between the parties in some way that is more direct. But you don't, of course, have access exactly to what's going on. There's not a lot of transparency. But you do have these repeated situations, like I said, where tension is building over the things that have been negotiated even in previous ceasefires that there's not enough progress on. And so that has been the claim of Hamas, at least publicly, in the last few months, a kind of building of tensions, promises that didn't kind of get fulfilled. And we saw an increasing use of flaming balloons, incendiary devices being flown over the border as a point of pressure on the Israeli government to do various things that have been agreed upon in the past. Now, in response to this, you had in the start of August, first a ban on certain entrance of certain items. The following day, August 12th, you had a restriction of the fishing zone. On the 13th, you had a ban on the entrance of fuel to the strip. Then on the 16th, a ban on fishing entirely. On the 18th, the power plant shut down for lack of fuel. And of course, like you mentioned, also direct strikes on Hamas targets within the strip. So, you know, I would say certainly that I agree with you that, you know, there's a very big difference between measures which are taken, which are in direct reaction to the threats that are faced. They're a direct reaction to the actor which is responsible for these threats. Versus these actions, which I mentioned in this timeline, which are directed towards the civilian population. And that is a very open kind of discourse within the Israeli, political echelon. They don't say that the ban on the entrance of fuel was connected somehow to the kites, you know, that you need the fuel to run the kites, or that you know the fishing has something to do with the people sending the kites. I mean, it's openly what we would call collective punishment. That is, it affects, of course, all 2 million people living in the strip, and is not directly connected to Hamas and to the actors who are engaged in the balloon launching. Yeah.
Just to go back a bit, you mentioned that there was a lot of rising tension and Hamas wanting to put pressure on the Israeli government. Are there specific aspects of the previous ceasefire agreements that the Israeli government had not been implementing that the incendiary balloons were trying to address?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you know, I think that there's a lot that we don't know and that goes on behind the scenes. So I'm weary to kind of pinpoint one thing.
Sure.
I will say that an ongoing discussion has been about the level of funding that enters the strip. So many of the people on this call may be aware that the Qatari government, for example, is one of the main kind of donors right now in the strip. They're responsible for a lot of on the ground kind of projects, major construction projects. They've been also funding the purchase of fuel for the Gaza power plant since the end of 2018. And they also give cash, basically cash handouts to families in the strip. And this has been a major source of, you know, it's a meager amount. We're talking about $100 to a family in need every few months. It's not really enough to sustain people, but it's of course something. It's better than nothing. And so there has been a lot of tension over the entrance of that aid, when it will enter, how it will enter, to whom it will go. That's been an ongoing sticking point. I think overall too, I mean, to step away a bit from the, those immediate needs, I think there is a larger question here, and I certainly am not aligned with Hamas, and I'm not a spokesperson for them, but there is the larger question of the relationship with Gaza and the humanitarian situation there, and projects which have been promised for years now that would be implemented by the international community. For example, to increase the supply of electricity to the Strip, to connect the Gaza power plant to a natural gas line, which would allow for more efficient creation of power, things like this, which have been discussed and which are always kind of being blocked. And the way that I always think about it is that, the whole kind of closure of Gaza, all of the restrictions that you have on various aspects of civilian life, whether it's fishing or fuel or movement of goods or movement of people, in my mind, they've turned into like chips in a poker game. And you have basically Hamas and Israel, but certainly maybe other actors around the table, negotiating in these elements of civilian life as a point of pressure and as political kind of maneuvering. So I think that, yeah, if you're zooming out and you're saying, what are the kites in response to, I think it's all of it.
Yeah.
You can't really point one specific thing.
So going back to the poker players, it was the Qataris who helped negotiate this latest ceasefire. Do you have any insight into that and whether the potential surge in coronavirus cases played a role in that?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that, I started with this timeline, right? And I didn't continue. There were additional measures. There was on August 23rd, additional restrictions on entrance of goods. So Israel basically said only food and medicine can go in. And it was the very next day that there was an announcement about community transmission of coronavirus. And I do think that this played a role. I think, like I said, this kind of negotiating and the political maneuvering, it's all based on what my analysis would be is a kind of, to keep the pot of water boiling, but make sure, to keep the pot of water hot enough, but not let it boil, not let it kind of boil over. So there's a desire to put pressure on, but not to have it explode into a full-blown military, escalation or war. And so I do think that there was a sense within the Israeli political echelon realizing, hold on, this may be going too far. And I'm sure also behind the scenes negotiations with Qatar and other interested governments to push back and say, this can't continue. That said, it did continue a whole nother week. So it wasn't until early last week, that these punitive measures were reversed, and we went back to the kind of regular situation, which is also, of course, very problematic. Yeah.
So how did the, these various restrictions, including barring the entry of fuel and other goods, actually impact the daily lives of Gazans, whether it's electricity, hospitals, schools, what have you, and what aspects of the civilian infrastructure were most stressed because of these decisions?
Yeah. So, Gaza experiences a chronic shortage of power. Even on a good day when you have the power plant functioning at full capacity, there are also lines of electricity from Israel that are purchased. Again, Israel doesn't provide this for free. It's purchased by Palestinians. Even when those lines are at full capacity, you still don't have kind of even half of demand met in the Strip. So that's a chronic situation. So once the power plant shut down for lack of fuel, you had a situation where instead of having between 10 and 12 hours of power per day, you went down to between 4 and 6, and we're of course in the height of the summer, so demand is quite high, and so you even had many areas of the Strip getting only 4 hours of power per day. And that would include, of course, hospitals, sewage plants, water treatment, getting water pumped to homes, you name it, the kind of whole civilian infrastructure is all based, of course, on electricity. So some of the main areas of concern were about sewage treatment. It's not a pretty subject, but yeah, you need to treat sewage, and untreated sewage in the Strip gets pumped directly into the Mediterranean. So as soon as there's less electricity, you have basically more untreated sewage being pumped into the Mediterranean. And that's, the same sea that I'm swimming in this summer. Another, problem is that you need to pump the sewage away from home. So there was a big concern about flooding. You also need to pump water, clean water. Well, there's not a lot of it in Gaza, but there is water going to people's homes. And that, like on a regular basis, you have many homes that don't get water every day. They might get water every few days. And so that kind of supply of water went down. Of course, the hospital system, on a normal day, of course, you need electricity in hospitals. Amongst the coronavirus outbreak, this became even more critical. You have a lot of people who are also in quarantine centers. They needed electricity. So you really have a whole host of kind of, impacts right away from these measures.
So there was really a lot of self-interest on the Israeli government's part to actually start getting that fuel back into Gaza because of how this could actually impact the public health of Israelis like yourself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I really believe that there is quite a bit of awareness about the public health crisis. Both from an environmental perspective and also just, public health. I mean, it's a little bit cliche to say, but I mean, now we know it better than ever. Illnesses, they don't wait for permits. They don't need checkpoints. They're crossing over. So I do think that there are many Israelis who are concerned about the situation. There was also sewage, raw sewage being, flooding into Israeli communities around the Gaza Strip. And communities complaining about that. So that was also a source of pressure. And, you hinted at it as well, the security ramifications of these kinds of measures. And like I said, this kind of balancing act of trying to keep the water from boiling. I do believe that there are many security officials in Israel who are advising against these measures. Over time, they've also advised against such a hermetic closure of the Strip because they know that it's bad for Israel. I mean, this cannot be in any other place in the world. Let's leave aside the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This kind of situation of desperation is really not a recipe for peace. And I think that that's something that many people appreciate. And unfortunately, there is a tension between the security and the political echelon where I think politicians are not really, they have no long-term view, and they're not taking into account the needs, let alone of residents of the Gaza Strip, but also the needs of their own population.
Right. So you had mentioned that the first case of transmission was announced, and that led to the ceasefire, or could have played a role.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of what the status is of coronavirus right now? How Hamas and other aid organizations have prepared or not prepared for a potential surge? What are they doing now to mitigate that spread?
Yeah. So, we were, I think that people were looking at the situation in Gaza up until now and breathing a sort of sigh of relief. I think a lot of us realized, that Gaza has no ability to deal with a big outbreak. And the Hamas authorities also understood this. So they imposed quite a stringent procedure on anyone coming back into the Strip from either Israel or Egypt. So people had to go into quarantine centers run by the government. I mean, they were kind of physically kind of locked down there for 3 weeks. and tested multiple times, before they were let out. So these kind of stringent measures, coupled with the fact, of course, that the borders are mostly closed, and the fact that, in the beginning of the pandemic, you didn't have a kind of natural flow of people from countries where infection was high at that point. So you didn't have so many travelers coming from China, from Italy, even from the United States back into the Strip. So this kind of combination of factors really kept the situation quite good. I mean, it was basically 6 months where you only had a few cases in the quarantine centers themselves. People were isolated, they were treated. You had one death up until I believe it was around then, this announcement of the transmission at the end of August. In the last 2 weeks, the situation has completely exploded, and it's a real crisis. And that kind of warning cry that we had in the very beginning of the pandemic is now kind of coming to fruition. So just in the last 2 weeks, you went from a situation of having about 30 active cases to, as of this morning, about almost 1,200 active cases, and also 9 deaths. So also just in the last few weeks, a number of people unfortunately dying from the virus. And there's a question about where did these cases come from, right? So like I said, you had a successful kind of isolation of people. And I think that basically what happened is that people were not being tested in the community. So it could be that there was kind of slippage, perhaps somebody working in one of the quarantine centers. You have staff in these centers who are preparing food, who are doing kind of security and other kind of tasks in the quarantine centers. So it could just be that one of them or 2 of them or 3 of them, of course, got out into the community. There was also a case that got a lot of attention of a woman who basically a family member of hers has a kiosk next to one of the hospitals. And it turns out much of the medical staff from the hospital come to this kiosk, and many of them were exposed. Recent numbers that I saw were about that 70 healthcare workers have tested positive already. So, I think that the fact that there's now tests being done is revealing a lot of the cases that we just didn't know about over the last months. And I think that, the situation is very, very fragile because you have, of course, the health issues, lack of equipment, lack of staff, lack of tests, things that are needed. Like I said, also the lack of electricity, these kind of chronic problems. And then the other thing, which I think, we've talked about in other places, is the economic situation, right? So right now, the Hamas authorities, after the community transmission was announced, they imposed an internal, what they call a curfew or a closure, preventing people from leaving their homes at first for several days, and then relaxing some of the restrictions in the southern areas of the Strip, where there are fewer cases, but leaving them mostly in place in the north, and preventing also people from crossing between districts. So there are 4 districts of the Strip, so people can't move between those districts. So, those measures, of course, we've all dealt with this in our own communities. You have these measures that are trying to stop the outbreak, but that, of course, then end up affecting people's livelihoods. And in the Strip, you have so much poverty and so many people depending on daily wages, and there's no safety net for these people. So, so I think that also I think contributed to the ceasefire, because I think that this idea of what is going to happen now, you have the health outbreak and the economic outbreak for all intents and purposes, which could really see catastrophic ramifications in the Strip.
Right. There's no $1,200 checks being sent to
Right.
these folks.
Right. Right.
So, you mentioned the Hamas authorities. Can you share a little bit more about other aid organizations that are playing their role, both whether it's the testing, whether it's providing beds? Are there ventilators? I mean, are any Gaza residents able to go to Israel to get treated? What is that aspect of the situation looking like?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So in no particular order. So there are about 90 ventilators that are kind of COVID appropriate in the Gaza Strip. The last figures I saw were that 60 to 70% of them were already taken by other patients, non-COVID patients in the Strip. You have a population of 2 million people. So like 90 ventilators is not very much. There were 72 and some have been donated over these past 6 months. So that's certainly a very worrying situation. In terms of, who's active on the ground, there are a number of aid organizations, some of them that have been quite prominent, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, of course, the WHO, UNRWA, the UN, refugee organization has clinics in the Strip and not its own hospitals, but it has been providing care to non-COVID patients. And it, of course, provides a safety net, in many ways to the refugee population, which is about 70% of the Strip. So yeah, there are a number of other kind of smaller organizations which I think are doing great work. Medical Aid for Palestine, for example, the local Palestinian Red Crescent Society. You have a number of actors doing their part to kind of plug the holes, but certainly overall the picture remains grim. I know also that just in the last days there are discussions between Gaza and Ramallah about how the PA can respond and how it can provide more support. And I think also the international community is sort of scrambling. The UN agencies that are active here are, in many ways, you would think like 6 months, it gave people plenty of time to prepare. But I think people got honestly a little bit what's the expression? They were like a little bit like lazy on the job or something like it, they were asleep at the wheel, complacent, thank you. Because things had been going relatively well and there were other kind of areas of focus and certainly high numbers of cases also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, certainly in Israel. And so people got a little bit complacent and I think now they're kind of trying to kick into gear. Yeah.
So that's really, really helpful. I'm going to ask one more question and then turn it to the audience. But just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A chat box to submit your questions, and I'll be going through some of those as well. So we've talked about the humanitarian crisis at large that was already going on pre-COVID. And you've insinuated some policy changes that the Israeli government could address, but if you could give the audience a sense of like 2 or 3 very quick things the Israeli government could do to help ameliorate the conditions in Gaza and facilitate a more prosperous economy, I think that would be really appreciated as well.
Yeah. I have a lot of recommendations, so I really would encourage also people to visit our website. We have a lot of information, maybe too much information, and a lot of recommendations. I think, of course, we're a human rights organization, so we would start with like the kind of basic disclaimer. You're never going to have a kind of solution without a political solution, right? We're talking about Band-Aids to a gushing wound. I really do think that the only way to solve this issue is an end to the occupation, some sort of political resolution to the conflict at large, certainly an end to the closure, all of those things. So I need to say that because it's really what I believe. That said, I do think there are, of course, immediate things that can be done. And I would start again with maybe one that's broad, but in my mind, very important. And that is no more collective punishment. You know, that especially in the pandemic, that should just be, you know, glaring for all of us, that you cannot purposefully put more pressure on a population that is already so vulnerable, that is suffering so much, a society that has been brought to its knees, as a matter of policy. That's just not acceptable in 2020. It was never acceptable, but especially now. And I think that would go a long way. I don't think that residents of Gaza want to remain dependent on charity. They don't want the UN to be there. They want to be able to work on their own and live on their own. And in many ways, you know, they're doing that, and of course have shown the world that they're very resilient. But these measures that are put into place prevent people from engaging in their livelihoods, in education and family life, et cetera, in ways that are very, very harmful. So that's a kind of umbrella one, but I think it's actually pretty easy to implement. Like there needs to be red lines, and the red lines are harming civilians, stopping fuel, stopping electricity, et cetera. Beyond that, I mean, we have three really basic you know, asks that we've been making about the kind of larger closure policy. And that is that there needs to be more entrance of goods. So certain items are marked as dual use, which means Israel believes they have both a civilian use and a military use. But the list that it holds is very, very broad. It includes basic elements of civilian life, things like wood, cement, even all of the machinery that needs to go in, the testing equipment for the coronavirus is considered dual use. So Israel needs to give approval to each and every item that goes in. And in many instances, it blocks, restricts, or delays the entrance of this vital equipment and vital you know, things that are needed in society. So I think that Israel should relax its policy on what it calls dual use items, on these very fundamental civilian items. It should also permit more freely the exit of goods. So the question about exit of goods, which goods can exit, where can they go? There's a lot that can be said about this. But these have also been poker chips. So you have certain items that continue to be blocked for exit. Many people may have heard me talk about cookies, processed foods, ice cream, jams, anything that is not a kind of raw food, you know, like a fruit or a vegetable, is blocked from exiting Gaza. And there is a processed food sector in the Strip. Not all processed food is bad, even though it has a bad connotation. And this is blocked from exiting the Strip. So we think that that's something that can happen very, very quickly, and it can allow a whole sector to function better. And then finally, on movement of people, which is something that for me is, in many ways, is the most important. On the one hand, you can't always put a price tag on it, and you can't say this is going to help the economy in these ways. But I think that for residents of Gaza, the feeling of suffocation, of not being able to plan one's life, of not being able to visit one's family members, is something that is the kind of daily suffering that accompanies them. And again, I would say in the era of the pandemic, we all know this much, much better. And I think that, you know, what we're seeing around the world is protests and outrage. People want to live their lives. They need to go back to work. They realize that there needs to be a better balance between protecting public health, but also protecting livelihoods and access to family. And I really, really hope people know I'm a eternally optimistic person. My real hope is that we come out of this and we say no one should have to experience these kinds of restrictions when they're unnecessary. So yeah, I think movement of people is something that is sometimes overlooked, but in many ways is the most painful and the thing that affects, you know, everyone in the Strip.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more on these proposals. I mean, collective punishment, it's abhorrent that it's even going on. And I was going to say, we all only have the teensiest version of experience having been through this COVID pandemic, but I do think it provides a window into what it must be like to not have any freedom of movement ever. So,
Yeah.
I want to go to the audience Q&A. We have some really good questions. And specifically, I'll go first with John Citrons, who asks, with regard to these policy proposals and, do you see any realistic way out of this impasse? Do you see any easing of restrictions or freedom of movement? I know you have the hope, but what is the realpolitik answer here?
Yeah, that's a hard one for me because, I'm not a realpolitik kind of person. I'm really focused on what can be done and what's possible. I mean, look, I will not deny that even for an optimistic person like myself, it's been hard to stay optimistic. I think that the moves towards annexation, many people think annexation is off the table. I'm sorry, it's not off the table. It's happening, every day. It's been happening. Annexation is a legal term, but for all intents and purposes, all of the actions related to annexation have already been occurring for a long time. I think that, the current Israeli government, but also past Israeli governments are revealing more than ever that they're not interested in a solution. They're interested in managing the situation. And so, managing the situation means keeping Gaza quiet. That's often the kind of lingo that is used. And so we might see a few measures here and there and easing here and there. I do think that in the coming period with this outbreak of the coronavirus, I do think that the assessment will continue to be that they can't push as hard as they have recently, though there are certainly also calls from within the government to act even more forcefully towards the Strip. And so, we don't know what will kind of emerge. I think that there could be a few off ramps, let's say, to the current morass. I think we have seen an awakening of some kind in the United States, and you and your audiences would be, I think, more, have more expertise on this than me. But what I'm seeing from the side does give me some hope. I think that more and more people are realizing that the way that Palestinians are treated, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, is morally bankrupt, that there is no justification for it, that it has nothing to do with security, that there are political goals that we don't support behind these measures. And I think that as more and more people realize that and reach places of power, to me, that is, again, see, I came back to the optimism. That again is a reason to hope that there will be more of a radical transformation. Regarding the Palestinian political reality, certainly a very complicated one. We don't have so much time to get into now. I think that if there were some kind of reconciliation between Palestinian parties, that this could also propel other actors to get more involved. I certainly think that the lack of political unity is an excuse by some, or maybe a good reason by others. It depends, for not getting more involved. So I'm not terribly hopeful that this will happen right now. So I think we need to move on other things, but that is also something that could take place. Yeah.
So again, as with most of this issue, it's about political leadership and making sure that there is a new crop that emerges.
Yeah.
We have a question from Robin Loop, and we started to get into this, but I think it would be helpful for our folks in the audience. Can you explain who is on the ground in Gaza that can advocate for its residents? Does Hamas have full decision making? So who is Hamas yeah, do they have the full decision-making over the Strip? Are they bargaining with these aid organizations, et cetera?
Wow. Okay. So, you know, there are certain kind of, in many ways, like parallel realities in the Strip. Hamas is in charge of the local government there. The PA in Ramallah also still has quite a bit of influence on what happens inside of the Strip. They're the ones that are in touch more directly with aid organizations. So the mandate that aid organizations get is by, for all intents and purposes, the state of Palestine and the PA representation. So if there is a new project in the Strip, you know, all of their operations are overseen or kind of agreed to by the PA. The PA also still pays for electricity supply and those direct lines, like I mentioned. It's paying for medical treatment that is received by residents of Gaza in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and it is also paying salaries to its employees in Gaza. So it's still, and there's more than that. Those are just some examples. So the PA is still very much active. But there is a kind of parallel reality, I would say, where, you know, the aid organizations certainly play a very active role, I would say, in keeping people's heads above water. You know, UNRWA, of course, is a major player in the Strip, educating, I believe, over 200,000 children on a daily basis, running several clinics and providing aid to residents and a number of other organizations. So certainly their activities are vital to, you know, the situation not becoming even more of a crisis than it is. And I think that that's one of the things that it's a kind of illusion. You know, on the one hand, before this crisis, before the coronavirus crisis, you know, Gaza wasn't like other places in the world where you have, you know, mass starvation or death or things like this because of the presence of these aid organizations, because of money that's flowing in from donor countries. And I always liken it to really just keeping people's heads above water, kind of keeping the situation also in Israel's favor, more quiet, because as desperation grows, of course, we've also seen instability grow. But it's an illusion, right? Because that means that any kind of, you know, bump in the road, you know, makes people sink below water. And I really think that these last 6 months, the economic ramifications of the pandemic, and certainly now what we're going to see, the health ramifications of the pandemic, are the thing that is going to make people's heads slip under the water. And as much as I try to stay optimistic, you know, I think we have a lot of work to do. And that's, again, why I'm grateful for this call, and I'm grateful for the audience paying attention. I think, you know, whether you care about human rights, whether you care about Palestinians, whether you care about Israel, I think Gaza needs really to be centered. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be brought forward. We can't just pay attention when there are kites, when there's a military operation, especially because, in my mind, and that's my personal opinion, to me that sends a message that violence is the thing that works. Violence is the thing that gets people's attention. I want people to be paying attention when it's totally quiet, when it's not in the news. I want people to be paying attention to the kinds of cases that we're bringing, of, you know, the cookie factory that's trying to get its cookies to Ramallah, people trying to visit their families, people trying to get to universities abroad. Those are the people who need to be rewarded and paid attention to. The regular people who are, of course, the vast majority of the Strip.
That's beautifully said. And we are trying to shine a light beyond these crises. And so I want to actually talk about the US role and both what folks on this call can do as well as what Congress can do. I got a question actually from the Hill. What is the best unified message for Congress to be sending to Palestinians and the Israeli government regarding steps that need to be taken right now to support Palestinians living in Gaza? And the second question, so the role of Congress, and then the second question is the role of US citizens, such as those on the call right now.
Again, I have so many recommendations, but I'll try to kind of grab a few from my mind. You know, I think that the US, and I say this because I'm also a US citizen, so I don't think I'm like intervening in US affairs. I vote still in the state of California for what it's worth. But, you know, I think that the US has a big role to play, especially, of course, because of the funding that has been cut to, you know, US aid, to UNRWA, to the Palestinians. That aid is vital, and the US, of course, beyond the financial role, has also, I think, played a political role in restraining in previous years some of the worst violations of human rights and some of the military actions as well that impacted civilians. So I think that the US has a role to play. I think that aid should be restored, and that should be certainly something that is you know, advocated for. I think that also Congress can play a role by talking about this more and talking about Gaza not just as a place of kites and Hamas and rockets, but human beings. And I know that that might seem so simplified, but I really think that it could do a lot of wonder in terms of shifting the discourse. You know, Gaza has been framed as this kind of dangerous place. And that means residents of Gaza are dangerous. And I think that the more that we talk about Gaza as a place, like I said, with 2 million people, a statistic that I bring up quite a bit is that 70% of the population is under the age of 30. So we're talking about 1.4 million young people who need a horizon, need a future, who have the same, you know, rights and needs as young people in America, to education, to get married, all of the things that we all want to do. And I think that normalizing our language of talking about Palestinians as human beings is unfortunately a feat in and of itself. So I would encourage members of Congress to do this more, and also US citizens, you know, to address. I think each person should get involved in the area that speaks to them most, because that ensures you'll stay involved. So, you know, I always give the example of like, you know, people who have a certain professional interest. I remember once visiting a member of Congress, and I realized right before going into his office that he had a lot of fishermen in his district. So I didn't talk about all of the other problems. I just talked about fishermen, and that was something that spoke to him. And he said, you know, that's something I can engage on, and I would have support in my community. So I really think that there are so many areas, you know, that people can get involved in, you know, depending on their own kind of interest.
So you brought up, you know, for Congress to speak about Gaza residents as if they're actual humans, which is definitely something we want to see change, and we want to be doing more of. It's not just a security issue. Restoration of funding, which I think Congress would want and has tried, but we have a Trump administration that's not willing to disperse the funds. Is there anything you would say to a hopeful incoming Biden administration to add on to that?
Yeah. I mean, look, I've heard a lot of people talk about how, you know, even if there is a Biden administration, it'll be really difficult to reverse some of the measures that have been put into place by the Trump administration. And, you know, I want to believe that there should be more leadership and imagination among a new administration, and that we shouldn't already set the bar so low. I do think that it's our role. I certainly consider my role as you know, running a human rights organization, to set the bar high and to continue to talk about the principles behind these things. And I do think that, you know, we can't just go back to the status quo from the before times. Again, I would hope that the pandemic shakes things up a bit more for everybody, and that, you know, a Biden administration wouldn't be just like an Obama administration. You know, we've had plenty of time to see the effects of the closure, now to see the effect of the pandemic on the situation in the Strip, and also a lot of suffering on both sides. Both Palestinians and Israelis suffering from these repeated hostilities. We need a more fundamental approach and a shift in the way that people are thinking about this. I would also say something that I didn't get to talk about very much, and that's also seeing the connection between what's happening in the West Bank and what's happening in Gaza. It's all one broader picture. So, stopping annexation formally, okay, maybe that's a good thing, but we can't afford to rest. There's still a lot to be done. And I think that, the situation in Gaza isn't what it is by chance. It's not just because Hamas is in power there. There's been a long process of isolating Gaza, of isolating its residents from people in the West Bank, a kind of desire to split apart the territory, a classic kind of divide and conquer approach. So I think that people who are interested in a solution to the conflict, let alone a two-state solution to the conflict, should be paying attention to Gaza and the West Bank as kind of two parts of the same whole. And really pushing for policy changes, I think, on movement and access, which would counter this kind of policy of fragmentation and separation, which we've seen for so many years.
Yeah. That is very helpful. I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions that folks have. These are a little bit more detailed, but then we're going to be wrapping up soon. So if you have any final questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat, and we'll try and get to those. So we have a question from Robert Weiss. Does Israel provide any medical aid, supplies, or personnel to the Strip? And if so, what? Can you guys give us a sense of that? And then additionally, I think you had mentioned aspects of the relationship between the PA and Hamas and any funds going into Gaza. And Shula Gilad asks, I thought the PA had stopped paying salaries in 2017. And I just add, can you comment on the relationship? You talked about that splitting and trying to keep them separate. The PA, can you talk about the relationship between the PA and Hamas and how it affects government salaries and other aspects of the economy in Gaza?
Okay.
So first, the question about Israel providing aid, and then the PA-Hamas relationship.
Yeah. So the general rule is that no, Israel does not provide aid. Everything that you hear about coming into the Strip, like I said, whether it's electricity or fuel, medical supplies, water, everything is either purchased by Palestinians or it's donated, supplied by foreign governments or aid agencies. There have been a few occasions, I believe, in the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, there was discussion or talk about Israel donating tests to the WHO and the WHO providing those to Gaza. I don't know how many, but it's a fairly small amount. So no, as a general rule, Israel is not providing aid. The only commercial crossing that Gaza has is on the Israeli border. So it's a crossing that's between Gaza and Israel. And so Israel, has say about whether it can allow that aid to enter. So Israel can facilitate entrance of aid or it can stop aid from going in, but it doesn't donate it to Gaza. In terms of the PA and Hamas, so yeah, the PA cut salaries. They basically reduced the salaries that were paid to its employees in the Strip. It put a number of employees on early retirement. So you had, tens of thousands of people who basically have been receiving partial salaries. And we're not talking about high salaries. We're talking, about I would say somewhere between $300 per month, up to maybe $1,200. So, any cuts to these salaries certainly has had an effect on the economic situation. And in terms of the relationship between the PA and Hamas, also, you could, of course, write books about this. Then there are people who have, more expertise than me on this topic. I would certainly recommend Tariq Bakoni has written a book about Hamas that I think could be of interest to this audience. It's a complicated relationship, certainly, and I think that there too, there's a struggle for kind of power and who will maintain control, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And so certainly that power struggle also has an impact on people's lives, whether it's these kind of delivery of services, salaries, putting pressure also on the population. But the PA, of course, also has a chronic budget crisis. So the reduction of salaries also had to do with its own internal kind of budget crisis and considerations. So yeah, again, in a nutshell, really. So
yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I'm going to ask one last question. This is a bit of a summarized question from the audience. It seems like to some extent Hamas has addressed coronavirus, or at least it tried to fairly well and was taking it seriously early on. Now, you know, perhaps not doing the whole testing that it needed to be doing. But there is potentially, I mean, a real blame to lay not just on the Israeli government, but Hamas itself in terms of the humanitarian crisis and the conditions its residents are living under. You know, what degree do you put that on Hamas, and, you know, how do Gaza residents feel about Hamas right now? So I'll leave it at that, and then we will close for the afternoon.
Sure. You know, I think, of course, there are a number of actors, like I said, sitting around this kind of proverbial poker table, and you could assign them sort of responsibility depending on their actions and their level of control. You know, I think that both my assessment is that Israel plays a very, very big role because of the control that it still wields over Gaza. So it deciding to stop entrance of fuel for the power plant, so the discourse, the Israeli narrative is, you know, Hamas made me do it. But it's the one that reached the decision to stop that fuel. So certainly Hamas is a player. It is taking actions, you know, which are counter to international law, in many ways amount to war crimes, the firing of rockets, for example, on civilian population centers in Israel. Israel has choices to make when it responds. And what we're asking it to do is to make those choices aligned with a set of values and a set of rules, a kind of the international rules-based order of international law. I don't think we're actually asking so much. Right. And I think that a lot of the rhetoric that we hear countering these requests is political in nature, right? We are labeled as traitors, not because we're actually traitors, but because we're asking the government to do something which is against its political interests. And I think, yeah, so that's my assessment, that Israel does play a disproportionate role, that Hamas also has a role, the PA has a role, the international community has a role, the actors on the ground who are working in the strip, who's going to be tested, where, how many people, etc., they have a role to play on the ground. I will say, of course, that you know, I'm running an Israeli organization. We are registered inside of Israel. I pay my taxes to the Israeli government. So, you know, I'm not shy about saying it's clear that my mandate is to get my government to act more in line with what I think it should be doing. So, you know, take that how you will. But like I said, I think that that's, it's a reflection both of their level of control, but and also of who we are and who our mandate is. So if you want to hear about Hamas's responsibilities and their actions, you know, there are Palestinian organizations that I really salute, who are doing amazing work on the ground to protect human rights and violations which are being carried out by the local government and also by the PA.
Thank you. You know, we similarly feel it's incredibly important that Israel play a constructive role as much as possible, and that Israel put an end to any form of collective punishment. And we really applaud your work at Gisha. So thank you, Tanya, for taking the time to share your insight, to really share your expertise. And we do want to continue the conversation. And I hope everyone on the call really takes it to heart that we continue to raise the plight of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, not just when there are rockets, but every day. So thank you all very much. And we will see you soon. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much.
Bye-bye.